In 1937, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, a short fantasy novel which rapidly started gaining popularity and which has recently been adapted in the form of films. After its strong success of The Hobbit, Tolkien almost immediately began working on a sequel, which would become The Lord of the Rings. Reading it, one seems to be caught up in a world which is very similar to how we remember the Second World War, as an epic struggle of good versus evil. The War of the Ring, which englobes all battles and conflicts on Middle-earth against Sauron, can be seen as a parallel to World War II in its whole, with multiple fronts and participants, all fighting against a common threat. Furthermore, diversity and unity are central topics in this saga, with the Fellowship of the Ring including different races, each with their own culture, abilities and characteristics, and where none of them is superior to the others. But had Tolkien ever used such an analogy before? If we take his uncompleted work, The Silmarillion, we can see a pretty clear analogy with World War I. In The Silmarillion, the side presented as the good doesn't always present ethical motives. It is ambition and a desire to rule what drives their actions. There are many points of contact between the Wars of the Duels and the political scenery of the early 20th century world. Much as the European and American colonial powers who, by 1914, had already extended their rule over a great part of the world in a race for power that would lead to the Great War. Both the Elves and the Númenóreans seek to conquer the lands of the East, later known as Middle-earth, to govern a realm there at their own will, rather as lord and gatherers of tribute than as helpers. Even Galadriel, who would eventually become a powerful ally in the fight against Sauron, had a rather imperialist mindset during this period. Back to the comparative analysis between the Second World War and The Lord of the Rings. As Peter Jackson, the director of the film adaptation, stated, Tolkien said that those who are enslaved, who are victims of the horrors of invasion and oppression, are right to offer resistance. This is the theme of the Second World War and, likewise, of The Lord of the Rings. However, after a detailed analysis, there are more similarities. Each nation in Middle-earth corresponds to a country that fought in World War II. In the first place, we have the nations of Evil, Mordor and Isengard, which are a reflection of the countries from the Axis. The first nation, and whose real-life reference is most evident, is Mordor, a dark, industrialized land full of forges and war machinery. This description can be compared to Nazi Germany, especially with its advanced technology developed through weapons factories and its focus on the total war. Mordor, under Sauron's leadership, seeks to conquer and dominate Middle-earth. This goal of expansion and domination is comparable to that of Nazi Germany, which, with its belligerent foreign policy, aspired to expand its territory and establish a totalitarian rule in Europe. Thus, Sauron, who represents absolute evil, and his quest for tyrannical power can be compared to Adolf Hitler. Both seek the subjugation of other peoples and use terror tactics to consolidate their power. Sauron uses various magical elements to maintain surveillance over the occupied territories. This is the case with his own eye and the Palantiri. Likewise, the Gestapo and the surveillance device of the Nazi state, as well as spy networks, allowed Germany to obtain strategic information vital to war decisions. It should be noted that there is another figure which could be compared to that of Hitler, Denethor, the steward of Gondor, whose desperation and madness lead him to self-destruction. Likewise, Hitler, faced with imminent defeat, fell into despair in his last days in the Führer bunker, eventually committing suicide. The other nation fighting by Mordor's side is Isengard, led by the wizard Saruman. By betraying the Free Peoples and allying himself with Sauron, he transformed Isengard into a war machine, which can be compared to Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy, which allied itself with Nazi Germany and participated in the war in Europe. Furthermore, Isengard's main function, other than conquering its neighbouring nations, is to provide the armies of Mordor with orcs to swell their ranks. Likewise, Mussolini sent Italian soldiers to fight alongside the Nazis in the war in Europe. The fall of both nations also presents common points. The Ents, led by Treebeard, rise in an unexpected and powerful march against Isengard that tears down the walls of the Orthanc Tower, destroying the war machinery and leaving Saruman powerless and isolated. In 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily and southern Italy marked the beginning of the end of the fascist regime. The Italian people and the anti-fascist resistance rose against Mussolini, who was deposed and arrested and eventually executed in 1945, marking the end of the regime. In both cases, the nation's fall significantly weakens its ally, marking a crucial point in the war and contributing to the eventual victory of good. On the other hand, we have the nations of good, Gondor, Rohan and Rivendell, which correspond to the allies in World War II. In The Lord of the Rings, several races and nations come together to defeat Sauron, forming an alliance known as the Fellowship of the Ring. This can be compared to the coalition of the Allies, who joined forces to defeat the Axis powers. Therefore, the meeting of the Free Nations in Rivendell shows points in common with the Tehran Conference, since in both cases the main leaders of the nations met to coordinate an alliance and a common war strategy to defeat their enemies. The first line of defense of the Free Nations against the attacks of Mordor is Gondor, and thus it is the first to face a large-scale invasion. Similarly, France was one of the first and most important targets of the German invasion, becoming one of the main battlefields in Western Europe during World War II. Gondor is a key nation for the defense of Middle-earth, since its fall would be a decisive factor for the victory of Mordor. France, for its part, was also crucial for the Allies' military strategy in Europe, since it was the only nation which, at the beginning of the war, was on continental land. Both nations also received help from their allies, allowing them to confront their enemies. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, a decisive confrontation in which the forces of Gondor and Rohan unite to defeat Sauron's armies, can be seen as a parallel to the Normandy landings on D-Day and the liberation of France, where the Allies staged a joint effort to reverse the Nazi advance. Hence, in both cases, a battle which changes the course of the war and allows the victory of the forces of good occurs. In addition, in both battles, the arrival of reinforcements from other nations is crucial. In the Pelennor Fields, the coming of the army of Rohan, led by King Theoden, and later the forces of the Army of the Dead, led by Aragorn, are decisive. In Normandy, the coordination and arrival of Allied forces were essential to the success of the invasion. The subsequent liberation of Minas Tirith, thanks to the intervention of other nations, can therefore be compared to the liberation of Paris. The other nation of men, Rohan, with its strong military tradition and cavalry, resembles England, which played a crucial role in the resistance against the Axis forces. Rohan is a vital ally of Gondor, coming to its aid during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, similar to the role played by England as the main ally of France, especially after the fall of the latter, continuing the fight against Germany. Rohan, under the leadership of King Theoden, shows heroic resistance against Saruman's forces. Likewise, England resisted during the bombings of the Battle of Britain, which, due to its context, can be seen reflected in the Battle of Helm's Deep. In it, the people of Rohan defend their fortress against Saruman's vast army. Similarly, during the Battle of Britain, the RAF and the British people, despite being numerically and technologically disadvantaged, defended their country against the powerful German Luftwaffe. In addition, both battles have great symbolic meaning. The successful defense of Helm's Deep gives hope and morale to the free forces of Middle-earth, marking the beginning of effective resistance against Sauron and Saruman, while the British victory at the Battle of Britain prevented the Nazi invasion and demonstrated that Hitler was not invincible, marking the start of the effective resistance of the Allies in Europe. The last race to be part of the Free People's Alliance are the Elves, especially those of Rivendell and Lothlorien. They initially stayed away from the main conflict, but ultimately united and played a crucial role in Sauron's defeat, similar to how the United States joined the war later than the other countries, but its intervention was decisive in the Allied victory. Like the United States, whose industrial and technological power surpassed that of the other allies, the Elves possess great resources and skills, superior to those of the other nations. When the War of the Ring is finally over after Sauron's downfall, the reconstruction of Middle-earth and the restoration of peace reflect the efforts to rebuild Europe and create new structures of peace after World War II, with actions such as the foundation of the United Nations and the rehabilitation of the economy through the Marshall Plan. Similarly, Aragorn's crowning and the restoration of the Gondor king's bloodline can represent the reinstitution of the legitimate governments in the countries freed from the Nazi and fascist control. As for the psychological effect of war on the characters who participated in it, we can see that the hobbits, especially Frodo and Sam, return home profoundly changed by their experience, as did many of the soldiers who went back to their countries after World War II was over. Furthermore, Frodo is so traumatized by the events he's undergone that he departs Middle-earth for the Undying Lands to never return. If we were to push the similarities even further, we could even consider his departure as a metaphor for those soldiers who struggled so much with the impact the war had on their mental health that they committed suicide.